The boss yelled at him for being late to the work meeting, but didn't know it was the new CEO. Welcome to Family Lies. Before starting, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this. I never thought I'd witness something like this, especially in a high-level corporate environment. Everything happened in a single day, but it felt like the tension had been building there for years. Lucia arrived quietly, almost invisibly. No one knew who she really was. She wore discreet clothes, carried a simple briefcase, and sat in the corner of the room as if she didn't want to draw attention. The meeting was already underway, but the moment she walked through the door, the local boss, a man everyone there seemed to fear, turned to her as if he'd found the perfect target to unload his pent-up anger. What no one knew was that this woman, silent and precise in her observations, was the company's new CEO. She had received news of her inheritance weeks earlier, when her father, the founder of the multinational, had died suddenly. The company he had built on solid values of ethics, innovation, and humanity was now almost unrecognizable. From the start, Lucia knew she needed to see everything with her own eyes before making any decisions. That's why she chose to enter as an ordinary employee that day. No one at the international headquarters had announced her arrival. The delay, in fact, was real. She had personally resolved a serious complaint about a batch of products that could have endangered lives, but there in that cold room full of people who barely looked at each other, all that mattered to the local boss was that someone had arrived late. What happened next was unsettling. The man, who led the meeting with rehearsed arrogance, interrupted a manager's speech just to point at Lucia. Without even asking her name, he snapped, "You think this is a cafe? You come and go as you please?" His voice echoed in the room, and everyone froze, as if even breathing was dangerous. Lucia remained standing, her expression neutral. She didn't retaliate or justify herself. She simply said with disarming calm, "I had to resolve an urgent issue related to a product batch's safety. I was on my way here when I got the alert." The man laughed, a dry, mocking laugh. "So now we have anonymous heroines saving the company? Write that down, João. Unexcused tardiness." The scene felt unreal. Some at the table immediately lowered their eyes. Others let out stifled laughs, clearly trying to side with the boss. But there were also different looks. An older man in the opposite corner watched with visible discomfort. A young woman with glasses who had barely spoken until then swallowed hard at every word the boss said. Lucia felt it all, not just the words, but the suffocating atmosphere forming there. She knew that if she wanted to change that place, she needed to see what numbers and reports didn't show. And there it was, the culture of fear, live and unfiltered. Her tardiness had been the trigger, but what surfaced was something far deeper. The meeting continued, but the mood didn't return to normal. The boss resumed speaking about goals and results with a confidence that seemed from another world, one where nothing went wrong and everything was his doing. He used too many technical terms, cited reports with suspiciously round numbers. Lucia, however, knew that kind of speech well. She had seen firsthand at other companies how data could be manipulated to hide abuses. She took notes silently, like any diligent intern would, but what she recorded weren't numbers. They were reactions. The fear in employees' eyes, the forced laughs, the way no one dared interrupt or question the shouting man. The turning point came when he presented a quarterly financial report. The numbers were slightly above expectations, and he seized the moment to praise his own management. He said he had trimmed the weak and disciplined the unruly, and that was why results were improving. Lucia closed her notebook slowly. His speech didn't match the confidential audit data she'd received days earlier. Multiple inconsistencies, inflated operational costs, questionable dismissals unrecorded in central HR. Still, she waited. She wanted to see how far he'd dare go, unaware of who was sitting in the last chair of the room. The boss then began talking about the company's new values, which made Lucia suppress a wave of disbelief. According to him, the organization now valued speed, obedience, and results. He said those words with such pride that he seemed oblivious to the absurdity. "There's no room here for drama, for sensitivity, for people who question orders," he said provocatively, glancing at Lucia. Someone at the table let out a nervous chuckle. Another pretended to cough. Lucia folded her hands in her lap. She breathed slowly, absorbing everything, recording each word with clinical precision. Her father had built that company to be the opposite of this. To her, this wasn't just about corporate culture, it was personal. When he finally asked for the meeting minutes to be recorded, the moment of final humiliation arrived. The assistant, awkwardly, read aloud the serious infraction of the new employee who arrived late, justifying the note for misconduct and negative impact on team morale. Lucia remained silent for a few seconds, then said, "The decision to prioritize customer safety can't be considered a mistake. If it happened today, I'd do the same." The room froze. It was the first time she spoke firmly. The boss leaned forward and snapped, "So you admit to disobeying a directive? Do you know what that means? You're fired." He laughed alone, as if he'd won some game. He still had no idea who was about to lose everything. The silence in the room grew heavy. No one dared support Lucia, though some expressions showed discomfort. It was as if everyone there had already learned that speaking up meant becoming a target. The boss took it as victory and pressed on, ranting about real meritocracy and zero tolerance for misconduct. He claimed authority was what held the company together, and only those who knew how to command deserved to be there. Inside, Lucia felt a mix of indignation and sadness. The legacy her father left was being torn apart, and the people who once made the company vibrant now seemed like shadows of themselves. She looked around once more. No one wore visible name tags. Contrary to her father's protocol, everyone equal, everyone with a name, everyone accessible. The air was thick with oppressive formality. Younger employees avoided asking questions. Older ones just nodded as if they'd given up fighting. The culture there was about survival, not teamwork. And Lucia understood painfully that this wouldn't be fixed with meetings or motivational speeches. The problem ran deeper. It would require courage, direct confrontation, and perhaps the risk of being hated by many too first. As the meeting neared its end, the boss asked for the doors to be closed. He wanted to speak openly with the trusted team. Lucia found it odd, but stayed. He then began indirectly attacking headquarters, complaining about people who've never set foot here trying to give orders. He said he didn't need spoiled heirs playing company. That hit her directly, but she didn't react. She let him keep digging. His words now came with a froth of anger, as if wounded by an idea he didn't yet understand. Lucia realized he already sensed something different that morning. Maybe her gaze or her silence was destabilizing his control. Then he announced a full team re-evaluation, promising cuts within 30 days. He said, "Too many people here are just coasting." And that was enough to create unbearable tension. The young woman with glasses, who hadn't spoken until then, crossed her arms and bit her lip hard. The older man exchanged quick glances with another manager. Lucia saw it. All the small signs of exhaustion, fear, suppressed resistance. This man fed on the terror he created, and the team, broken, fragmented, silent, was its direct reflection. It was time to end this charade, but she had to do it precisely, without losing the moment's impact. Lucia calmly asked to speak. The boss frowned, clearly annoyed, but waved a dismissive hand as if to say, "Go ahead." She stood, opened the briefcase she'd carried since arriving, and placed a small stack of documents on the table. "Before this meeting ends, I think it's fair to clarify some information." Her voice was firm, but not aggressive. The boss scoffed. "You're still here?" he said, not hiding his contempt. Lucia didn't respond. She picked up the first document and read aloud a technical note about flaws in the previous quarter's accounting records. Then, she presented a second document with evidence of goal manipulation. This data was audited by headquarters. It was validated yesterday. The silence was immediate. No one moved. The boss tried to laugh, but his expression wavered. "You have no authority to present anything here," he said, his voice lower. Lucia then pulled a badge from her blazer's inner pocket and placed it on the table. It was the new CEO badge. "I think I do now," she replied. Some employees widened their eyes. Others looked at the floor. The boss paled. It took him seconds to process what was happening. "You're," he stammered. Lucia gave a slight nod. "I'm Lucia Herrera, the new CEO, and I'm here to understand what happened to the house my father built." The reaction was a silent shock. The boss stepped back as if slapped. His eyes darted around the table for support, but no one spoke. Even those who'd laughed at his jokes were frozen. The young woman with glasses seemed to hold back tears. The older man shook his head slightly, as if something finally made sense. Lucia remained standing, never raising her voice. She said her arrival had been kept quiet, precisely to avoid rehearsed speeches. She wanted to see the company as it really was, and now she had. "What I found here wasn't leadership, it was fear, and that's not what this company stands for." The boss tried to recover. He called it all a big misunderstanding, claimed he'd acted under pressure, said the data was open to interpretation. He appealed to the numbers. "The results speak for themselves, Lucia." But she interrupted him, firmly for the first time. "You confused fear with respect and power with leadership. Today, the company chooses a different path." There was no going back. With a gesture, she handed a folder to the Ethics Committee representative, who had been quietly summoned earlier. Inside were reports, confidential testimonies, and archived emails, enough to justify immediate termination. The room stayed in absolute silence. The boss was escorted out by security, called discreetly via internal message. No one applauded. There were no cheers or sighs of relief. The mood was different, a heavier silence, as if everyone needed minutes to process what had just happened. Lucia knew this wasn't the time for inspirational speeches. It was time to reorganize, to listen, and that's what she did. She sat at the head of the table and said simply, "I want to hear from you. What's happening here? What needs to change now?" Her tone was calm, but the authority was undeniable. The first to speak was the oldest manager, his voice low and measured. He said he'd tried warning headquarters for 2 years, but his messages never got through. "Everything was intercepted," he said. Then came the young woman with glasses, revealing the customer service team had been overloaded with unrealistic deadlines, affecting product quality. Other voices followed one after another like a dam breaking. For the first time in years, people were being heard. Lucia took notes. She didn't interrupt. Her eyes welled up discreetly, but she kept her composure. She knew her father would have done the same. Over time, the testimonies deepened. They spoke of recurring public humiliations, meetings where lights were turned off to yell at someone, veiled threats of dismissal, even disguised pay cuts labeled as internal adjustments. A young IT analyst said he'd taken medical leave for anxiety and insomnia after weeks of pressure to falsify reports. The fired boss had used a network of influence to shield his decisions and distort any whistleblowing. Lucia listened, silently, but the impact was visible on her face. She felt responsible, even though she'd never been there before. This was part of her father's company, and she was now its face. Only after nearly 2 hours of accounts did Lucia stand again. The meeting no longer felt formal. It was almost a support group. She sincerely thanked everyone for their courage. She didn't promise to fix everything overnight, but guaranteed 3 immediate actions: protection for whistleblowers, a review of abusive targets, and a suspension of all performance evaluations until further notice. She also announced a task force to restructure internal processes and asked for spontaneous nominations of trusted team leaders. The mood was still cautious, but a thread of hope began weaving through the tired expressions. Before adjourning, Lucia asked for a moment alone with the oldest manager. They went to a small, windowless side room, likely where many harsh meetings had happened. There, she thanked him personally for keeping the company afloat in the shadows. "I know it wasn't easy," she said, looking him in the eye. He took a deep breath. "For a while I thought I'd become complicit, but I couldn't leave. I hoped someone would come back, that you'd come back." The words moved her. More than gratitude, Lucia felt the weight of all that had been neglected for too long. Her father's legacy was wounded, but not dead. Back in the main room, part of the team still lingered, talking quietly. They weren't sure if they should leave. Lucia said the day was over, but that everyone would have one-on-one meetings in the coming weeks to hear stories, understand roles, and redraw the company's path. "Today isn't an ending. It's the start of real work," she said simply. A young product employee raised his hand awkwardly, asking if they could have a direct whistleblowing channel to her. Lucia said an independent ombudsman and anonymous suggestion box would be set up, then added something unexpected. "If you want to talk to me, my email is Lucia Herrera, and I'll read everything." Then a young HR employee asked to speak. She said she'd tried implementing improvements, but all her ideas were blocked or ridiculed. Once she'd been called a naive idealist for suggesting a mental wellness program. Lucia listened, then said firmly, "Idealism with action builds the future. I want that program on paper by Friday." The woman smiled for the first time that day. It was as if someone had started believing they could be part of something bigger, and that moved everyone around them. As the meeting ended, employees left silently or in small groups. The hallway felt different despite lingering tension. Lucia walked slowly to the former president's office, now the ex-boss's command center. Inside, it was dark, with heavy curtains and overly ornate furniture. The air was stale, as if sealed too long. On the desk, she found a notepad with scattered notes, surreal targets, angrily scribbled, and a small box with employees' names and derogatory nicknames. It hurt. She packed everything into an envelope, labeled Internal Review, Toxic Culture. In the office, Lucia found an old photo of her father hidden on a high shelf behind old books. It showed him with the founding team smiling around a board with the company's values in blue marker: respect, innovation, people first. She sat quietly, staring at the photo. For a second, she wanted to cry, but she breathed deeply. It felt like a lump in her throat. Frustration and relief mixed together, as if she were reclaiming something that was hers, but had been buried slowly, unnoticed. Alone in that dark space, she understood the scale of the challenge. Lucia left the office and asked maintenance to seal it temporarily. She said the space would be renovated into a company memorial, not to glorify the past, but to learn from it. She went to the admin sector and reviewed recent contracts, finding more signs of mismanagement, duplicate payments, ghost services, inflated clauses favoring the ex-boss's connections. She took notes, photos with her phone, and announced a full audit for the following week. Employees watched from a distance, still surprised to see her there, unguarded among them. By 4 p.m., Lucia went to the company cafeteria, a large but cold space with distant tables and generic motivational posters. Some employees were finishing late lunches. She took a simple plate, rice, grilled chicken, salad, and sat at a back table without fanfare. Slowly, some approached, not out of obligation but curiosity. They wanted to see if this was real. An older janitor said, "I've worked here 30 years, never saw a president eat with us." Lucia smiled. "Now you will." It was the first collective laugh all day. Over lunch, a young designer mentioned a proposal to improve internal communication that she'd never been able to present. Lucia asked her to email it directly. A logistics employee said drivers were punished for delays caused by faulty routing systems, something beyond their control. Lucia noted that too. She was there, listening, asking precise questions without interrupting. This wasn't an act, it was method. Each word fed her strategic vision, but more importantly, her emotional commitment to these people. The company needed to be made by people again, not fears. After lunch, Lucia went to the back parking lot where operational vehicles were kept. A group of employees smoking. They froze when they saw her. One, his uniform stained with grease, joked, "If I'd known the boss was coming, I'd have worn cologne." Everyone laughed, including her, but the joke became an opportunity. Lucia asked about vehicle maintenance, and the stories poured out. Recycled parts logged as new, rushed repairs risking accidents, service orders ignored to avoid delaying production. All covered up with falsified reports and threats. It was worse than she'd expected. Lucia took notes, not just as CEO, but as someone who wanted to understand each cog's pain in this machine. Fear still ruled. People spoke while glancing around, lowering their voices. One employee said she'd considered quitting, but now wanted to wait and see what changed. That touched Lucia. The company couldn't remain a place of survival. It had to become a place of belonging again. Before leaving, she thanked them, shook each hand, and said she'd return. And she meant it. She'd come back unannounced, unscripted, to ensure this day wasn't just a promise. Back in the main building, Lucia found a handwritten note at reception addressed to her. It was from a former legal employee, fired months earlier, who'd heard the news and left it with security. It read, "If you want to understand what really happened, find me. I'm not afraid anymore." That confirmed the damage ran deeper than reports showed. The culture of silence had crossed boundaries. She photographed the note and kept it. Another piece of the puzzle. She'd need to assemble in the coming days. This wasn't just cleanup. It was institutional rescue. Before 6 p.m., Lucia returned to the now empty meeting room for a final check. She sat in the same chair she'd occupied hours earlier as a nobody. She scanned the table, the windows, the walls. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Something had shifted. Not just the ex-boss's absence, but as if the air had been renewed. She took her notebook and jotted a quick list. Product safety, active, listening, contract audit, culture rebuild. Below it she wrote, urgency without rush, because she knew that despite the day's impact, real change wouldn't happen overnight. But the first step had been taken, and it was massive. On her way out, Lucia passed a group of employees still discussing the day's events. They fell silent, unsure how to act around her now. But she approached naturally, thanked them for their dedication, and said no one would be punished for honesty anymore. One employee, visibly emotional, said, "We thought no one saw what was happening here." Lucia nodded, feeling the weight of those words. That was it. For years, what the company lacked was exactly that. Someone who saw, not just numbers, but people. In her car, her body finally gave in. The tension in her back, neck, and jaw collapsed all at once. She sat in silence for minutes before starting the engine. There was no euphoria, just her brain processing the avalanche of information, reactions, revelations. The day had been an emotional and strategic marathon. She thought of her father, how he'd have hated what they'd done to his dream, but she also felt he'd have been proud of how she'd faced it, without yelling, without humiliating anyone, but without backing down. This was just the beginning, and she knew it. Before driving off, she texted the ethics committee, "Phase 1 complete. Let's meet with coordinators tomorrow morning." She wanted to act while the day's energy was alive. She knew rumors would spread. Resistance would rise. Not everyone would be ready for change. But she couldn't wait. As she drove through near-empty streets, the city looked different. The same, but seen through new eyes. As if dismantling the company's theater had also removed lenses she'd worn without realizing. At home, Close to 8 p.m., her son ran to her with a drawing. "Look, Mom, I drew our company with everyone smiling." She smiled, moved. The simple sketch showed people holding hands, open windows, trees. In the yard, one detail stood out. In the corner, her son had drawn a small figure in a suit with a big heart. "That's Grandpa," he said. Lucia broke down. She cried right there on the living room floor, holding her son. It was the only moment she let herself crumble, because despite the strength she'd shown all day, she was still human. After putting her son to bed, Lucia sat at her home office and opened her laptop. Her inbox was flooded. Support, doubts, shock. Directors who'd stayed neutral now praised her courage, as if securing their place in the new game. Others demanded urgent meetings, but what stood out were the anonymous emails, brief, blunt accounts from those still too afraid to identify themselves. People who wrote, "Today you saved us," or "I thought it'd just be another leadership swap." Alone, she felt the real scale of the impact and the real weight of the responsibility that came with it. She closed the laptop after half an hour. Enough for today. She needed rest. But her body stayed on alert. In the kitchen, she drank water while staring out the window. The quiet street, the lit lampposts, a distant dog barking. She thought of the weeks ahead, the confrontations, the structures still to be carefully dismantled so no one trapped beneath got crushed. Firing one oppressor wasn't enough. The whole system that fed him had to be retaught. But in that simple moment, the silent street seemed to say she was on the right path. And sometimes that's all one needs to hear. Upstairs, she passed her father's slightly open study door, now kept as a memorial. She turned on the soft lamplight, taking in the management books with margin notes, the framed quotes he'd always repeated, the old leather chair where so many decisions had been made. She sat there, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. She remembered watching him as a child, hearing him say, "Companies are made of people, not spreadsheets." It was time to honor that. In a desk drawer, she found an old notebook. Inside were meeting notes from years ago, scribbles, integration program ideas, notes on employees he'd seen potential in. She flipped through carefully, as if revisiting a time that once seemed unreachable. On one page, a hastily written line stood out, "If everything falls apart one day, may she know how to rebuild." Her heart clenched. She didn't know if it was about her, but she chose to believe it was. And that night, it was enough, because that was exactly what she was doing. Rebuilding, with patience, truth, and real people beside her. Lucia turned off the light, closed the study door, and went to her room. She lay in bed, but sleep didn't come. Her mind replayed every word exchanged, every glance, every silence that shouted louder than words. She thought of how some had stayed silent, not from cowardice, but survival, and how others, despite having power to act, had chosen omission. Those were the ones she'd need to confront most firmly. The fear ingrained for so long had become culture, and culture, more than any process, was the hardest thing to change. In the dark, she remembered the exact moment the boss had told her to shut up, still unaware of who she was. That scene echoed like a dull blow in her memory. His tone, his look, the way he'd spoken to her as if she were trash. Not because of the tardiness, but because he thought he could. And that hurt most, knowing it wasn't an isolated mistake. It was standard practice, leadership based on fear and humiliation. Lucia knew that if it hadn't been her in that chair, it would have been someone else, maybe without the power to fight back, and that's why she kept going. She wasn't there just for herself. She was there for all those who couldn't be anymore. After a few hours of light sleep, Lucia woke before her alarm. The sky was still dark, the world outside suspended in time. She showered slowly, dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, and went downstairs to make coffee. As the water boiled, she mentally reviewed next steps. She'd go to the company again that day, quietly. She'd talk to each department, not with speeches, but by listening. She didn't want to be seen as a savior. She wanted to be known as someone who cared, who understood that behind every spreadsheet was a person who breathed, felt, suffered, and tried their best. At sunrise, she sat at the table with her coffee. She remembered her last conversation with her father months before his death. He'd been weak, but still spoke, of the company with bright eyes. He'd said he didn't fear death. He feared seeing what he'd built, distorted by soulless people. "Don't let them kill what's human in our work," he'd said. Back then, she hadn't grasped the weight of those words. Now she did. And she felt ready to do things differently, not perfectly, not error-free, but ready to stop pretending not to see. And in that scenario, that alone was a revolution. Before leaving, Lucia kissed her sleeping son's forehead. His drawing lay on. His nightstand. This was for him too. For a future where work didn't mean suffering, where kids wouldn't grow up watching their parents crushed by inhuman targets or daily humiliations. She left quietly, carrying a different weight, not of pressure, but of mission. She knew she'd face sideways glances, internal resistance, traps disguised as goodwill. But she also knew she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. At the company, the atmosphere felt different. A cautious silence filled the halls, as if everyone was still processing yesterday's events. Lucia didn't go straight to the CEO's office. She stopped at reception, then the admin floors, greeting people with steady eyes and a slight smile. Some looked down, others returned it with surprise or relief. This was the new routine she wanted: closeness, not fear, listening, not surveillance. The road would be long, but the first step had been taken. And it had happened on the day she'd been humiliated, as if the lowest point had unintentionally become the strongest push forward. In the CEO's office, she found an envelope on the desk from the communications team. Inside was a copy of yesterday's meeting minutes, complete with the secretary's notes and official records of the leadership change. It felt strange to see in writing what had been so intensely lived. One line stood out, her words: "You confused fear with respect and power with leadership. Today, the company chooses a different path." She read it silently, feeling the weight and reach of what she'd said, not for the phrase itself, but for what it symbolized. The turning point. She left the envelope on the desk and looked around. The room still bore traces of its former occupant: laminated motivational posters, stacked folders like control trophies, a handwritten agenda with rigid schematic notes. She'd redesign it all gradually, replace canned phrases with spaces for real dialogue, impossible targets with feasible plans. The door, once always closed, would now stay open whenever possible. Not as a symbol, but because she truly believed no one should fear walking through it. The greatest symbol wouldn't be new furniture. It would be the change in people's eyes as they passed by. Soon, a compliance employee entered with a folder of documents collected during the audit. Lucia thanked her and reviewed the contents carefully. There was proof of harassment, financial deviations, systematic data manipulation. Many of these documents had been ignored or buried out of fear. Now they were in the right hands, and they wouldn't be hidden again. For every silenced victim, there'd be a path to redress. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The wounds had to be cleaned so the company could truly heal. Next, she met with the new ethics committee and employee representatives. The mood was still tense, but tinged with restrained hope. Lucia spoke little. She preferred to listen, to hear about silences that hurt more than shouts. About days when people left work wanting to quit their professions. About times when mistakes were used as weapons, not learning opportunities. And there, in that brief, honest meeting, she realized it wasn't just the company that was sick. The people were. And if she didn't start with them, everything else would just be window dressing. That afternoon, crossing the central hallway, Lucia passed the same employee who discreetly handed her water after the public humiliation. They exchanged a brief but meaningful glance. The woman smiled slightly as if to say, "I saw everything." And also, thank you. Lucia didn't respond with words, just a nod, her eyes mixing respect and gratitude. It was in these small gestures that she found strength. She didn't need applause or reverence, just knowing she was making a difference, healing cracks too long ignored. Later, alone in the CEO's office again, she watched through the window as employees left for the day. Some still seemed wary, others visibly relieved. It was as if the company's rigid, suffocating structure was finally giving way, not from weakness, but renewal. Lucia took a deep breath. She knew the road would be long, that problems hadn't vanished just because the toxic boss was gone. But she also knew she'd planted something different that day, something that couldn't be faked or forced, something born precisely from the pain, shame, and courage of facing it head-on. Before leaving, she stopped by the room displaying portraits of past company presidents. Her father's photo was still there, his gaze serious yet kind. Lucia stood before it in silence. What she felt wasn't longing, it was responsibility. She knew he'd have been proud of what she'd done, but also that he'd have warned, don't lose yourself along the way. She didn't want to. She didn't want to become just another cog in the system she claimed to fight. So in that moment, she promised herself she'd remember that humiliation every day. Not as trauma, but as origin, as the reminder of where it all truly began. When she finally left the building, it was night. The air felt lighter, the city less oppressive. In her car, she turned on the radio without registering the song. Driving home, her mind still spun from everything that had happened. In just one day, she'd lived what many take years to face: exposure, confrontation, revelation, and rebuilding. The strangest part was realizing it all happened because she'd been late, for a reason that until then had seemed small. Life had an odd way of showing what truly mattered, and now nothing would ever be the same. At home, her son was still awake, half asleep in front of cartoons. She sat beside him, running her fingers through his hair. Today was an important day, she said. He didn't fully understand, but leaned his head on her shoulder as if to say it was okay. And in a way, it was. Not perfect, not solved, but moving. For the first time in years, Lucia felt she wasn't just reacting to problems. She was building a path, a hard one, full of traps, but hers, and that was already more than most ever achieved. To this day, those present at that meeting struggle to explain what happened. Some claim they knew who she was from the start but stayed quiet. Others swear they were stunned by the revelation, but all agree that was the day the company truly began to change. Not because of a new logo, speech, or aggressive targets, but because someone chose to confront the system from within, unannounced, without seeking glory. And because that person understood that sometimes the most honest changes are born in the silence of shame. Things like this don't happen every day, but that day, it did.